Take a network break. I'm Drew Conry Murray.
I'm Jonna Johnson.
Help yourself to a virtual donut as we parse the latest tech and IT news. Jonna, what are we talking about today?
Well, Drew, we've got a whole lot of cybersecurity related news, including an eye opening announcement about Salt Typhoon. We've got Arista's Stackable campus switches, some thoughts on Intel CEO resigning, HPE's financial results, and more.
Yeah, a lot to get to. But first, just a reminder today we have a Tech Bites podcast sponsored by Fortinet. At the end of the show, we're going to talk about IoT and OT risks and how to mitigate them. One option from Fortinet is their FortiLink NAC. This is a free feature that can help you segment and protect IoT and OT devices and even deploy virtual patches. There's also FortiNAC, which is a full bore NAC solution. We'll get into the differences between the two offerings and how they work. That'll be at the end of the show. Just a reminder, we're coming into the holidays. If you're looking for that special something for the IT nerd in your life, we now have a store. It's store.packetpushers.net. You can get Packet Pushers gear or logos from your favorite show. You can put it on a sweatshirt, t-shirt, mugs, water bottles, hats, notebooks, and more. So maybe for you, maybe for the IT nerd in your life, check it out. And if you're looking for a book gift, my book, The Haunting of Edward Drake, is available on AWS as a paperback or ebook, and also on barnesandnoble.com. Just a suggestion for maybe a stocking stuffer. John, let's get into red alerts.
Okay, great, Drew. Well, it's been a busy week. There have been more than 12 CVEs with a score of 9 or higher, including a couple tens.
Ooh, perfect
However,
tens.
yeah, right? None has an exploit in the wild. The most prominent of the ones that have been posted is a bug in the monitoring application WhatsUp Gold, not to be confused with the communications application WhatsApp. This is
Right.
WhatsUp Gold. This is for versions released prior to 2024. The score is 9.8 and indicates a flaw in how the application handles file and path information, which can allow a remote unauthenticated attacker to execute code in the service account's context. So if you're looking it up by CVE number, this is CVE 2024 46909. Progress Software, who is the maker of WhatsUp Gold, issued updated code back in September to address earlier CVEs that also fix this problem, and an advisory, please update your installs now. So if you're running an earlier version of WhatsUp Gold, stop listening to us and go fix it now.
Moving on, I've got a Cisco alert. It's not a 9 or higher, but I think it is of relevance to our listeners. Cisco's warning that there's a bootloader vulnerability in its NX OS that could allow an attacker to load unverified software. An unauthenticated attacker would need physical access to the device, and an authenticated local attacker would need admin credentials. The bug does affect multiple NX OS platforms, including Nexus 3000 and 7000 series, as well as the 9000 series, both in ACI mode and NX only mode, as well as two UCS series fabric interconnects. A patch is available. Cisco says there are no other workarounds. So if you are on these platforms, that's also something to take a look at. We will have the link in the show notes. Johnny, you teased earlier some interesting news coming out related to the Salt Typhoon attacks on US telcos.
Yes, so we have some rather unprecedented news here. CISA and FBI officials have now advised anyone using a mobile phone in the US to issue clear channel transmission. In other words, please use encryption. This is noteworthy for a bunch of reasons. First of all, this is, and just to put this in context, this is in light of the ongoing Salt Typhoon attacks that have been happening for the past 5 years since the beginning of 2020 and have recently really roared to a crescendo as investigators have discovered how badly compromised all the U.S. telco networks are, and quite possibly other networks. So you may want to follow that news in your own country.
Yeah.
However, here in the U.S., the big news is that the agency said commit to using encryption if you are a cell phone user. This is noteworthy because the FBI has in past opposed encryption. And in fact, they're kind of weasel wording it because they say, please use quote unquote responsibly managed encryption. In FBI speak, that means encryption that we can also hack. So please don't use Signal or WhatsApp. The CISOs I've talked to about this are like, yeah, sure, whatever. They're a lot more concerned about privacy than about the FBI being able to look at their data. So they are, in fact, using Signal or WhatsApp.
Hmm.
So, yeah. The agencies also advised telcos to beef up their security, and rather annoyingly, by implementing a long list of standard security measures. And that's the piece that's annoying, is that, good heavens, you'd think they'd been doing this for the past 5 years, but they haven't. Things like applying default deny all access control lists and disabling any unused protocols. But the bottom line is this is a really big freaking deal. You've probably been hearing mumblings and grumblings about Salt Typhoon out at the periphery of your consciousness. Um, Now you are basically going to have a hard conversation internally with your security team and with your management saying, what, if anything, can be sent over the clear? And oh, by the way, that includes from employees' personal phones.
Yeah, I really do think this is interesting, and it's not surprising the FBI is finding itself kind of in a hard place because it doesn't really like encryption for obvious reasons. But now that our telecommunications networks have been compromised, and I've read reports that said in some cases attackers were actually able to eavesdrop on communications or get access to text messages, so not just metadata, but
Oh yeah,
actual
not and
payloads.
not just in some cases. This has actually been ongoing. And
Yeah.
here is the truly scary and nerve-wracking part. The Chinese are nothing if not thorough, so they have been certainly saving everything that they're getting, and with the encrypted messaging, they will continue to save it. And then
Mhm.
once we get quantum computing cracking cryptography, which is estimated to happen within the next 18 months to 5 years, probably ETA around 2028, they'll go back and read everything that they've captured that was encrypted. So fun.
Fun, yes. Yeah, that's a whole nother issue. And there are now new encryption protocols released and blessed by NIST that are supposed to be quantum resistant. We actually did a whole packet protector episode about that. I'll drop that in the show notes if you want to go listen. But again, I think what's interesting here is the FBI sort of finding itself on a couple of different forks. Like, okay, we can't just let unencrypted communications happen anymore, but it's going to kill us to actually have to say signal on WhatsApp.
Exactly. Well, and they wouldn't say that, but honestly, I would stand short of recommending it, but certainly any encryption is better than none.
Mhm.
Personally, I use WhatsApp preferentially, but it has nothing to do with the encryption, although I'm now very glad that I do.
Mm.
Um, I would also remind everybody that it doesn't matter whether these are phones that were issued to employees or whether employees are using personal phones to do to transmit corporate data. You're going to have figure out how to keep them from doing it, and that's not easy because that involves going to your employees and saying, keeping access to pretty much anything off of their personal phones. And most folks have kind of given up the ghost on that fight, so it's going to be an interesting challenge in 2025.
Yeah. So moving on, but a related story related to Salt Typhoon, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission is proposing a new rule for communication service providers to annually certify to the FCC that they, quote, create, update, and implement a cybersecurity risk management plan. The FCC is asserting that CSPs already have a legal obligation to secure their networks from unlawful access or interception of communications under existing U.S. law, and now they also want them to have a plan, present it to the FCC, and have it certified every year. John, I feel like this rule is kind of anodyne, but maybe there are legal implications that aren't clear to me.
Perhaps, and sort of more broadly, I think the other thing to ask is, well, pretty much any telco in the US has to file reports with the SEC because they are large public companies. So
Right,
we already saw the SEC measures go into effect that require an update the quarterly financial statements indicating whether there's been a breach or not. That
right.
may, in fact, be behind why we know about what's going on with Salt Typhoon as opposed to not knowing it previously. It's kind of like, well, we walked into the kitchen and we turned on the lights as opposed to walking in the dark. Um, but I do think it highlights something that concerns me, which is you've got the FCC regulating telcos, you've got various entities regulating banks, you've got the SEC regulating any public companies, and it's not clear that all these regulations are aligned. So at some point, we're going to have to sit down and rationalize what it is we're asking everybody to do about cybersecurity, because otherwise, large companies will simply throw up their hands and say either we're not going to do any of it, or we're just going to sit here and do nothing but file cybersecurity updates and forget about anything else. And either
Right,
one is not optional. And oh, by the
right.
way, let me further remind everybody that here in the U.S., we're having a regime change in January, and the incoming regime is notoriously hostile to regulations. So some of
Yes.
these may be rolled back, repealed. Who the hell knows? So we'll see.
That's right. I mean, I guess the action for telco CEOs or CIOs, CTOs, CISOs at this point is let's wait and see what happens. But I would hope at the minimum they already have cybersecurity risk management plans. So maybe this isn't too much of an ask. I also don't know that I want the FCC outlining specific, infosec procedures for these companies to take. But I do think obviously this is an issue, and maybe No, that's not true. More scrutiny does not necessarily lead to better infosec. That's a stupid thing
Yeah,
to say.
exactly what I just said.
Yeah,
And the tell here is exactly that. They have to present their plans, but what they're really relying on is the embarrassment factor because my plan could
right.
be, when in danger, throw up my arms and scream and shout, and that's my plan. And the FCC might laugh at me, but there's nothing in there that says it has to meet standards. So here's my plan.
I mean, I think there's a hint in there from what the FCC is saying is that you already have a legal requirement to secure this infrastructure, and if
Exactly.
you are not securing it, maybe there are legal penalties that we could think about down the road. I feel like that's sort of sub rosa being communicated here, but it hasn't been adjudicated, it hasn't been tested in court, so yeah, I'm not sure. Um, Although I suppose, if you're looking for a guideline on how to roll out a cybersecurity risk management plan, if you're a communication service provider, CISA, the NSA, and other U.S. federal agencies have released joint guidance for hardening communications infrastructure. This isn't, getting down into the weeds of like what firewall settings you should use, but it is providing general instructions, things like disable SSH version 1, use SSH version 2. If you're using SNMP, upgrade to SNMP version 3 with encryption. Also note that this release from CISA and others is calling out specific guidance for Cisco devices. They're saying US agencies has observed Cisco specific features being targeted. Recommendations include disabling Cisco Smart Install service, disabling the guest shell access, and disabling non-encrypted web management capabilities. And again, this is all tied back to the communication service providers or telcos being hacked by Salt Typhoon. So some hardening guidance from CISA and other InfoSec agencies.
And the fun never stops. Let's talk about security issues that are not related to Salt Typhoon. Secret Blizzard has taken over other criminal command and control networks. On December 4th, Black Lotus Labs, which is Lumen's threat research arm, reported uncovering Russian based threat actor Secret Blizzard's successful campaign to hijack other criminals' networks. Before you say yay, the group has infiltrated command and control nodes of the Pakistan based Storm 0156 group, which focuses on espionage. This 2-year effort is the fourth such infiltration campaign by Secret Blizzard since 2019. And here's the kicker. By exploiting other threat actors' C2 servers, they can acquire sensitive files that others had already exfiltrated without the risk of exposing their own tools or having those exfiltrations trace back to them. So you may be thinking, oh, great, it's awesome that they're going after the other bad guys, but unfortunately, it just means they're getting all the loot that the other bad guys already got. So that is not a good thing.
Not a good thing. I'm wondering if like do criminal networks have sort of weekly stand up calls where they're like, where are we on our risk management profile? Did you file your paperwork?
Exactly. The FCC wants to know. I mean, that's the thing to keep in mind. All the bad guys are not being hampered by having to file lots of paperwork and meet regulatory compliance. I don't believe there is such a thing as hostile actors.
No, it's true. They don't have to do the paperwork, but they're still operating in a risk environment that's almost identical as the people they're going after. It's just kind of this funny turtles on top of turtles world we're living in.
Yes, I guess it is. And in any event, we actually do have some news today that is not security related, hard to believe.
Yes, networking news. So Arista Networks has announced a new stacking capability for its campus switches. They're calling it SWAG or Switch Aggregation Group, and this new capability lets enterprises stack up to 48 switches. These switches have a centralized control plane and can operate with just a single IP address. They can also be managed and automated by the CLI. And if you're wondering if this podcast has somehow traveled back in time to the 90s, don't worry. Arista says it has a very good reason for adding a stacking feature. That's because not having stacking has been keeping them out of enterprise campus deals. I spoke to Arista about this announcement. They said the stacking feature was driven by two big customer requests. The first is many of their customers have built their campus network operations around stacking. They've got scripts and processes already built around these stacks. Second, these enterprises are dealing with IPv4 address scarcity. Having a stacking feature lets them operate multiple switches with a single IP so they can conserve IP addresses. It also lets them minimize the licensing costs of network management and monitoring software that bills per IP address. Jonna, thoughts on this? Back to stacking?
I mean, it's sort of what took them so long.
Maybe they were waiting like, guys, you don't need to do this. Just come on, please. Let's try something more modern. And then business is business. And they had to be like, all right, fine.
Yeah, and I guess going back to the enterprise and saying, guys, you should just use Net 10, maybe not such a good idea. And in fairness, they say they also support ring and chain topologies as well as a leaf spine option if you want to be just a little more au courant with your stack.
That's right. When I was talking with them and they mentioned, IPv4 address scarcity, I was like, we have IPv6. Do people know we have IPv6? And for the IPv6 Buzz podcast, sorry guys, this kind of thing must drive you crazy.
Well, I'm just sort of coming back to that. The real problem, Drew, is that IPv6 offers very few real advantages to enterprises. Yes, DHCP is much easier and a few other things, but basically nothing that really overcomes the barrier and nausea of having to readdress absolutely everything, particularly since, as we found out in the year 2000 issue, a lot of applications had hard-coded IP addresses in them.
Mm.
So the problem is IPv6 was sold to everybody 25 years ago as this great new thing that would give you new features. And actually, the new features were already available in v4. Nobody needed them. Yes, it was slightly more complex, but there wasn't really, the juice wasn't really worth the squeeze to enterprises. And in a lot
Mhm.
of respects, that's sort of still the case. So unless you've completely run out or doing something ab initio, why would you renumber if you don't have to?
Well, that's what the whole IPv6 Buzz podcast is all about. Maybe you should get them on Heavy Strategy and have a good argument. I think they would enjoy that.
Nah, I've beaten so many people about the head and shoulders, including the people who developed IPv6, like Scott Bradner, who was at the time at Harvard. So I'm that
You're
that
done.
that era is
You've left
firmly
the
in my
field.
past. Yes, yes.
All right. So just to wrap this up, the swag stack option is going to be available in Q1 of 2025 with an EOS software release. So if stacking has been the only thing holding you back from Arista in the campus, you will be happy to hear this. And I guess I have to say, sort of one of my critiques of Arista is that they don't really put a lot of energy into the campus. I can't say that anymore. They have,
Fair enough. They have now
yeah,
signaled that the campus is an important market segment for them.
they are taking it so seriously. They are traveling back in time to make this happen. One more story. After struggling for 4 years to turn Intel's fortunes around in the wake of its worst quarterly losses ever, and after laying off 15% of the workforce and suspending dividend payments for the first time in 30 years, Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger has been forced to retire by the board as Intel CEO. He's going to be succeeded on an interim basis by Michelle Johnston Holthus. She's the EVP and general manager of the cloud computing group, and David Zinzer, who's CFO. They will operate as co-CEOs. Jana, we had just been talking about Intel last week, how they had secured almost $8 billion in US government funding, and now suddenly Pat is being shown the door.
Well, I think that makes sense, Drew, because although he's done a lot of good things, first one was securing that funding. There's also building that foundry business, which we can talk about in a second. It's great that he did these two things, but he really completely, utterly, and totally missed the boat on AI, and that's really kind of not forgivable in a CEO. It's unfortunate, but with all that pay and all that prestige, you really need to be making the fundamental decisions correctly. And I know it's a tough job. I don't mean to criticize him, but if I were the board, I would have done the same thing. I'm like, dude, you drove off the interstate into a cul-de-sac, and now we're trying to figure out how to save the company when you should have been riding super high. So
Do you feel like it's Pat Gelsinger's fault that they missed AI? I sort of feel like AI just kind of fell into NVIDIA's lap as opposed to other chip companies missing it. Is that fair?
no, it's not, because I do know that internally there was a lot of noise. There was a lot of recommendations, people saying AI is coming down the pike. You need to prep for it. You need to plan for it. You need to at
Mhm.
least, you know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, you should be on top of this. It's kind of, it's a bit like, not to get into politics, but the whole issue of, hey, we have a playbook for the next pandemic, pay attention to it. We have,
Right.
here is the AI transformation that's coming, pay attention to it. And I know that that was told to him, and it was advice he disregarded for reasons of his own.
Okay.
And obviously you can't take all the advice that your lieutenants provide you with, because, that you can't make any decision that way, but that was a key piece of advice he should have listened to and didn't.
Yeah. So one of his other strategic initiatives was to build this foundry business, which would allow Intel to make chips for third parties. On the one hand, it's maybe a missed opportunity that they didn't do it sooner, but the other hand is it requires huge investments of capital. And I think Intel was tired of seeing all that money go out the door without any return. Although, as we covered last week, as part of the deal to get federal funding, Intel has to maintain a controlling stake in the foundry business. So it's not clear to me that a full spin out is an option unless they want to walk away from those billions of dollars. So whoever's coming in as the new CEO has a lot of work to do.
Well, and I think one of the other challenges there is it doesn't get talked about a lot, but the foundry is really for advanced chip manufacturing techniques.
Yes.
So it's not like, some competitor can come in or, someone picking up the low end, lowest common denominator can use Intel's leftovers, so to speak, leftovers of
Hmm.
technology. It's
Hmm.
sort of like they're targeting extremely high end customers with this foundry. So it's a difficult dance because, on the one hand, they're going in the right direction. Obviously, today's high end is tomorrow's lowest common denominator. But on the
Right.
other hand, it means you're not going to get a lot of cash coming in while that growth curve starts to ramp up. So it'll be interesting to see what they do there.
Yeah, and I've read some things saying that, chip design is one thing, which Intel was good at. Actually building a foundry and manufacturing the chips themselves is another thing. TSMC and Samsung and others have put all of their focus into that. So can Intel sort of operate in this split mode? I guess we'll see. That's going to be the decision for the next CEO, I think.
Exactly. And so, kind of wrapping up on corporate news, Drew, I know you had some comments on HPE's Q4 2024 results.
Yep, HPE reported financial results for Q4 of its 2024 fiscal year. The company earned net revenues of 8.5 billion, up 15% over last year, and that 8.5 billion is a record quarter for the company. They also had net earnings of 1.3 billion. By business unit, HPE, the server business brought in 4.7 billion, up 32% year over year. Its intelligent edge networking business had revenues of 1.1 billion, down 20% versus last year. Hybrid cloud was 1.6 billion, up 18%. For its full year, fiscal 2024, HPE had revenues of 30.1 billion, just slightly above last year's results. And sort of the big thing people are focusing on HPE is the Juniper acquisition. They are signaling green lights ahead for the close of that acquisition in early 2025.
So I guess if you happen to be working at Juniper, that's not bad news. It means you're joining a healthy company. If you've made some commitment for your company to use HPE gear in any way, shape, or form, that's probably also good news. It's kind of nice to see a company putting its head down and just executing. Nothing fancy, stays out of the news other than the major acquisition, just keeps chugging along, making new product releases and delivering value to its customers. Not a bad thing.
Yeah, I guess the one maybe little warning sign might be
Mhm.
that its networking business was down 20%. That is only one quarter. So I was peeking a little bit at some of the transcripts, and they're saying, yeah, we know the networking business has been flat, but we're anticipating more purchasing coming through in the next couple of years as customers have finished digesting all of the networking gear they bought during the pandemic. So they're hoping that they will be able to welcome Juniper into a slightly more bright environment in 2025.
Well, and also Juniper will provide lots more stuff to sell.
That's
And
true. And it'll
HPE
have
is,
AI in it.
well, what doesn't these days? But yes.
All right, that wraps up the news portion of the show. Stay tuned for our sponsored Tech Bytes conversation with Fortinet about protecting IoT and OT devices. That's coming right up. Today on the Tech Bytes podcast, sponsored by Fortinet, we talk about IoT and OT risks and how to mitigate them. One option from Fortinet is FortiLink NAC. This is a free feature that can help you segment and protect IoT and OT devices and can even help you deploy virtual patches. Another option is FortiNAC, a full-bore NAC solution. We'll get into the differences between the two offerings, how they work, and how to decide which one is a better fit for your network. Our guests from Fortinet are Chris Hinz, Senior Director, Product and Solutions, Secure Connectivity, and James Allen, Senior Director of Product Marketing and Solutions, LAN Access, and Zero Trust. James and Chris, thanks for being here. So first off, IT and OT networks have lived in separate worlds for ages. Why is it that OT systems like industrial controls and sensors and other things are now starting to fall under IT's remit?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've seen a trend over the last several years where IT teams are being asked to begin to take over some of the OT-based networks administration, specifically because whereas OT networks previously were air-gapped, meaning they had no access to the internet or to other networks, now we're seeing them enabling access for the purposes of management, of proactive maintenance, vendors coming in and being able to maintain their equipment. And so now these OT systems need to fall under security policies that that they may not have previously fallen under.
Yeah, I
Eh,
almost feel like it's a chunk of the network that before everyone had been content to just leave be on its own.
Yeah.
Now there's an expectation that it needs to be beholden to what IT is doing throughout the rest of the company.
And my understanding is OT devices, particularly on the industrial side, I'm not thinking about like printers or something, are just they present a different risk. So what might IT not be familiar with in terms of the risk profile of these devices?
Yeah, they're dealing with very sensitive environments, as you can imagine. I mean, manufacturing floors, but then they're also dealing with, the things that affect our day-to-day lives, water treatment plants, other areas where, something going wrong in those environments can have a very negative effect. So when you look at the need to protect these environments while still enabling them to perform at the best of their capability, looking at the network and providing appropriate segmentation and looking at these devices and their patch levels is key. A lot of these OT systems, they're running older code.
Hmm.
They obviously can't be taken offline to be patched. So it's a very big challenge for a lot of these administrators to tackle.
Yeah, James, I think you what you touched on there, the idea of being always on. These OT systems can never have downtime, or when they do, it is highly planned, highly scheduled, and it's only happening once every long length of time. It really means that patching or updating code is something that oftentimes is really avoided when at all possible. Certainly, we as Fortinet, we always encourage people to ensure that you have the latest patches. We want to ensure everybody is fully secure, but we do understand that that can make a real challenge for OT systems where they cannot afford for things to be down any longer than a small service window.
And my understanding is a lot of these devices you can't, put an agent on, so you can't run a local firewall or anti-malware or anything that way.
That's
You just
correct.
need to leave these devices alone, essentially.
Yeah, that's correct. And we see that not only in OT environments, we see that often in IoT environments as well, where it's very challenging to put some type of code or sensor on a IoT or OT device.
So let's dive in then. FortiLink NAC. What is it, and what protection is it providing for the IoT and OT realm?
Yeah, FortiLink NAC is a feature within our secure LAN solution at Fortinet. It is specifically for Fortinet equipment, so our switches and our APs that are managed through FortiOS. And what we're able to do, we know that network administrators, whether they be administrating an OT network or small or medium business or a distributed enterprise, continue to struggle with identifying and controlling devices on their network. And so this feature was developed with Fortinet being a very much security focused company to enable them to be able to deploy NAC, whereas it had been in a challenge before because of the use of .1x and architectural challenges. This free feature basically enables you to, with a few clicks of a button, identify the devices that are coming onto the network and
Mhm.
automate the onboarding of those devices into secure policies. So not just segmentation, not just putting them into a separate VLAN, but also being able to even microsegment and implement layer 7 policies all the way down to the port level and the WLAN level.
And James, it also allows us to extend some of those great FortiGuard services, such as our IoT recognition, as well as OT services, to help keep the latest device updates in mind, and therefore leverage those in the recognitions and some of the rules that can be implemented in FortiLink NAC.
And just to be clear, this is a feature that's available if I'm using Fortinet switches and Fortinet APs in my network.
That's exactly it. So if you're using Forti switches and Forti APs that are managed through FortiOS, this feature is free to you. It's not licensed, and it's available out of the box. The profiling functionality is based in FortiOS, and the control is enabled by that management of FortiOS of our switches and APs, extending that layer 7 control all the way down to the switch port and WLAN. Now, for environments that don't have our Forti switches or Forti APs, we actually do offer a product called FortiNAC, which enables you to have the same level of control, similar to what you would see with some competitors out in the marketplace for multi-vendor environments.
Okay, yeah, we'll get into FortiNAC in a minute, but let's stick with FortiLink NAC for now. So again, it's a free feature with if I'm using Fortinet APs and switches. When I think of NAC, I think of 802.1x, as you mentioned. I think of supplicants, but as you mentioned, you don't need that with FortiLink NAC.
No, no, you're leveraging the same functions that drive our overall secure LAN solution, which is FortiOS managing and controlling our switches and APs. And with that, because we have that layer 7 visibility, we're able to profile devices and automate the onboarding and control into secure policies.
And when you say identifying the devices, how are you able to do that?
So we're able to profile within FortiOS. So FortiOS is a layer 7 capable firewall. So we're looking at, everything from, the device coming at, say the link light comes in, we're looking at the MAC address of the device.
Mhm.
We're looking at what traffic it's attempting to pass. We're looking at even things like its DHCP request, and we're determining what that device is based on that. We also, additionally, for the carpeted space, all those profiles are built in. When you start to move into OT, because there's such a plethora of devices out there, we actually have a service as part of our FortiGuard OT service that enables you to identify even more devices specific to an OT environment. But basically, it's profiling that is part of the FortiGate that enables small and medium businesses and distributed enterprise to enable this technology in the carpeted space.
So I mentioned virtual patching in my intro. What is virtual patching and how is it applied to my use of FortiLink NAC?
Virtual patching is a very interesting feature that we're able to offer in conjunction with FortiLink NAC. The feature is actually part of FortiOS and our FortiGuard services. What we're able to do is, because we're actually seeing the device and the traffic it's passing, we're also able to scan it for vulnerabilities as well. So we're able to determine if a device actually has a vulnerability to a known vulnerability. As you know, Fortinet is a leading security vendor, and so we keep track of a variety of different vulnerabilities, and we track them with CVEs, commonly in the industry, that gives us an ability to know the kill chain for a particular vulnerability. So when we detected a vulnerability on a device, what we're able to do is to develop a patch that will address that specific vulnerability. Now, what FortiLink NAC does for us is it enables us to implement that patch all the way down at the port level or on the WLAN level. So we're able to implement that patch closer to where the device is. And we're able to set those policies up to where they can not just segment them, with this particular policy, but we can go so far as to micro-segment if necessary, based on the vulnerability and the vulnerability level.
And one of the nice things about this takes dealing with a vulnerability on a piece of equipment, and you particularly think about some of those OT environments you were mentioning earlier,
Mhm.
where taking a piece of equipment offline can be highly problematic. This changes a critical vulnerability on a piece of equipment from being a fire drill of having to deal with it and trying to wonder what you're going to do to being a planned methodology. Thinking about your next service window, roll an update into that plan for that next service window, and have the downtime be a planned activity, knowing that you have virtually patched in the short term. Very, very different than a mad scramble when you find out a vulnerability and you need to make sure that you are not compromised, but don't have any other tools at your disposal in order to handle that vulnerability.
Yeah, it's not
But
as if we're saying this is a replacement for patching a device.
hmm,
We really strongly encourage, as the first line of defense, to patch devices. However, just as Chris said, often in OT environments, you can't take that device offline. But it's not just OT environments. We all have been in IT for a long time. We know there's sometimes a server sitting underneath someone's desk that hasn't been touched and can't be touched. And you want to be able to implement some level of protection for that device to make sure that it's not compromised.
And is a virtual patch then essentially kind of like an IDS signature? Like this this OT device has this potential exploit, so I'm looking for some kind of something in the payload of inbound traffic aimed toward that device, and I'm just going to block that attempt to connect. Or what is a virtual patch? Can you get into more detail?
So it's going to depend, right? Because what we're doing is we're looking for a vulnerability that's already been identified, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
example, it's a listed vulnerability. It's got a CVE, and so once we determine what those vulnerabilities are, it's going to vary what that patch looks like based on that CVE. So it
Hmm.
may be blocking of certain command and control aspects, right?
Hmm.
Certain ports, but it's going to vary based on that CVE. Each one has got an individual kill chain, and what we're looking at is what do we need to put into place to eliminate the ability for that exploit to be activated.
That's
Okay.
correct, James. We really will tailor the compensating controls to match how that particular vulnerability is exploited.
Yeah. So that's we've been talking about 40 link NAC. You've also got a 40 NAC offering, which is different from 40 link NAC. Can you get into how 40 NAC differs?
Yeah, absolutely. FortiNAC is a full-featured NAC product, right? NAC is a very mature market. There are a number of vendors in this space, and you know the demands of that space, whether it be the use of .1x, um, the ability to be able to manage multi-vendor networks, and so on, that need exists. And we have a lot of our customers out there who maybe they don't have a Fortinet end-to-end Fortinet network. Maybe they're thinking about going to an end-to-end Fortinet network, but they're not there. They're not there now. We also have customers, OT customers, for whom that is just not going to be realistic. They have, a variety of different switch vendors and so on that they may be using. For
Hmm.
that purpose, FortiNAC gives them the ability to have that level of control and integrate them into our security fabric. So we're able to do additional functionality like virtual patching, but then the patch, rather than being implemented on the switch port or at the WLAN level, is there at the firewall itself or at FortiOS level itself. And so FortiLink NAC is a free feature that's offered just for an end-to-end Fortinet solution. FortiNAC offers a multi-vendor option for our customers, as well as additional expanded capabilities, anomaly detection, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so if I've got vendor A's switches and vendor B's APs, but I still want a NAC solution, FortiNAC would integrate. FortiNAC is the solution I would go to.
Exactly.
What about things like ICE or ClearPass? If I've already got that deployed as well, can I still use FortiNAC?
Typically, you're going to have one vendor that you're choosing to control those switches and those APs. I will say, for example, for something like ICE, it is specific to Cisco equipment.
Hmm.
ClearPass can be used in a variety of different environments, but there are some .1x requirements there. Fortinet doesn't have those .1x requirements. It can use .1x, but it can also use other means to be able to control those switches and access points, making it a little bit easier to deploy than some of the other solutions out there. That integration piece, though, usually there's got to be just one control uh, um, for your wired and wireless network. The only time we've seen it be otherwise is one controls wireless and the other controls switching, but that's
Hmm.
rare. We haven't seen that very often. I don't know if you agree with that, Chris, but I haven't seen that very often.
No, I usually see people kind of settle on the one that they're planning to use. Definitely, as we kind of move, as you talked about, James, as we've seen customers maybe move upon their journey with Fortinet, it is not uncommon for them to move to Fortinac as kind of part of that move as they plan to slowly migrate products over time into the security fabric And
Mm.
Fortinet, as you called out, James, is a great way in the interim to tie older vendor product that you are planning to replace in the next 2 to 3 years into the fabric in the short term until you can have a full Fortinet stack.
We've also seen it go the other way, where we've seen customers who have initially implemented FortiLink NAC across their enterprise, and then they are looking for some of the more additional features that perhaps FortiNAC offers, and have upgraded from FortiLink NAC to FortiNAC. Perhaps they've become larger, or they've integrated another company or something along those lines. But we have seen that transition as well, where people go from the feature to the product, depending on what their needs are.
And just to clarify one last point, the virtual patching I can get with FortiLink NAC, but also FortiNAC.
Yes, it just all comes down to where the patch is deployed, right? The patch is deployed in a FortiLink NAC scenario. That patch is deployed as close to the edge as you can get. It's deployed on the switch port or on the WLAN. Whereas
Mhm.
when we're looking at it from a FortiNAC perspective, it's deployed at the FortiGate. So depending on where the FortiGate is placed in that scenario is where the patch would be implemented.
Well, James and Chris, we're at the end of our time together. If folks are curious about FortiNAC, FortiLink NAC, or anything else, where should they go?
Well, we would highly encourage you to go out to our website, www.fortinet.com/LANEdge, and that will give you a wealth of information about this feature as well as the overall solution from Fortinet.
All right, that's fortinet.com/LANEdge. We'll have that link in the show notes. Also, for folks who may not be familiar with Fortinet's switch and AP portfolio, we also did a Tech Bites on that, so we'll drop that link in the show notes as well if you want to go get all this information. But in the meantime, thank you, Chris and James, for joining us, and thank you to Fortinet for being a longtime sponsor. Sponsors do make everything we do here at Packet Pushers possible. Speaking of everything we do, you can find this and many more fine, free technical podcasts and our community blog. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can hear us on Spotify, and if you would leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.